There is something deeply strange happening in the world right now, and almost nobody is connecting the dots correctly. The country that controls the second largest economy on Earth just publicly declared its support for a nation that Washington has been trying to economically strangle for 47 years, and the strangest part is not the declaration itself, but what that declaration reveals about a process that has been quietly unfolding for years, while everyone was looking somewhere else. The Western media is telling you this is a diplomatic gesture and nothing more. And the analysts on your evening news are reassuring you that Beijing is just playing politics and that China will never sacrifice its $500 billion trade relationship with the West for the sake of Tehran, and they are technically correct and completely wrong at the same time, because the question was never whether China would sacrifice its Western trade for Iran. The real question is why China no longer has to choose. And that question changes everything you think you know about how American power actually works in 2026. Let us start with a fact that should be on the front page of every newspaper in the world, but is not. On March 2nd, 2026, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called his Iranian counterpart and officially stated that China supports Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, security, territorial integrity, and national dignity. This came immediately after US and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, and it was not a backroom whisper or a vague communique. It was a public declaration broadcast on Chinese state television, read by CCTV to 1.4 billion people. And here is what the mainstream media is not calculating this morning. China was not taking a new position. China was simply announcing what it has been doing in practice every single day for years. The reason this story is not being explained to you properly has nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with incentives. Western media companies have enormous advertising revenue tied to financial institutions that depend on dollar stability. Nobody in a glass tower in Manhattan wants to explain on live television that the foundational architecture of American economic power is structurally weakening one tanker at a time in the Persian Gulf. So let us explain it ourselves. In 2025, China was buying more than 80% of Iran's exported oil, accounting for over 1.5 million barrels per day. It was doing this through a network that US Treasury officials have been documenting for years, a shadow fleet of aging tankers that disappear in the Strait of Hormuz, change their names, turn off their GPS transponders, and reappear in Chinese ports carrying what official customs data describes as Malaysian crude. The oil was never Malaysian. It was Iranian, laundered through ship-to-ship transfers in anchorages near Malacca, while satellites tracked the chemical signatures of the cargo that paperwork denied. The United States knew this was happening. The US Treasury sanctioned more of these networks as recently as February 24, 2026, targeting Iran's shadow fleet and ballistic missile procurement channels. But sanctioning individual shell companies in this system is like cutting one head off something that grows 3 more overnight. The companies are designed to die and be reborn the next day, under a different name, in a different jurisdiction. So, here is the machine that nobody is describing clearly. China and Iran signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement in 2021 worth up to $400 billion. That agreement covers Chinese investment in Iranian ports, railways and telecommunications infrastructure in exchange for preferential access to Iranian oil at discounted prices. By 2025, the two-way trade between China and Iran had grown to $83 billion annually. The payment mechanism bypasses the dollar entirely, using a closed-loop yuan settlement system run partly through the Bank of Kunlun, where Iran can access its oil revenues but can only spend them on Chinese goods and services. Think about what that means. Structurally, Iran cannot take that money and freely purchase wheat from Brazil or medicine from Germany. It can only buy Chinese. It creates what analysts are now calling a mercantilist trap, where Beijing gets discounted oil, energy security, and infrastructure influence, while Iran gets economic survival. But the key point for understanding what just happened this week is this: Washington's entire 47-year sanctions strategy was built on the assumption that dollar exclusion equals economic isolation, and that assumption just broke. If you have savings in a currency that is used in international trade, and you are watching that currency's share of global transactions decline from 98% in 2015 to 54% today, you should be paying close attention to this story, because it is not abstract and it is not far away. And we are going to explain exactly why in the next few minutes. Now let us talk about the man in the most impossible position in Washington right now. The U.S. Treasury Secretary is sitting in a room this week, facing a decision that has no good outcomes. His team has presented him with essentially three options. Option one is maximum secondary sanctions against Chinese banks and companies involved in the Iran oil trade. These are sanctions that would target not Iranian entities, but Chinese financial institutions doing business with Iran. Secondary sanctions of this scale against China would trigger what economists estimate as a direct reduction of 1.2 to 1.5% of US GDP within 12 months, at a moment when the American economy is already absorbing the shock of oil prices elevated by Middle East conflict. Option two is targeted symbolic sanctions against specific smaller Chinese entities involved in military technology transfers to Iran, including what Reuters reported on February 24th, 2026, as Iran being close to finalizing a deal for supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles from China. These targeted sanctions are technically satisfying and operationally meaningless. The entities vanish and reform. They are a press release, not a policy option. 3 is to call Beijing directly and ask privately what it would take for China to maintain operational neutrality, even without declaring it publicly. Option 3 is not a strong hand to play when you're supposed to be the superpower. Now let us look at the invisible force that has been working against Washington's position for the past decade, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of economic weight. China is currently the primary trading partner of 128 countries. The United States is the primary trading partner of 56 countries. In 2010, those numbers were reversed. This did not happen because of a single decision. It happened because China spent 30 years building infrastructure relationships and payment systems in places where Washington was focused on aircraft carriers and intelligence operations. In January 2026, China's permanent representative to the United Nations reiterated China's opposition to any military action against Iran at the Security Council, with Russia alongside as a permanent member that is a structural double veto on any UN resolution that could legitimize expanded military operations. The two-country blocking mechanism at the UN means that any multilateral legal framework for escalating pressure on Tehran is simply unavailable to Washington in 2026, regardless of what the intelligence says. And now we reach the part of this story that the Atlantic Council analysts and the Brookings Fellows on your television are carefully not saying out loud. In February 2026, China, Russia, and Iran formalized a wide-ranging strategic pact covering energy trade, military coordination, and diplomatic strategy. The full text is still being released, but Iranian, Russian, and Chinese officials confirmed it covers joint military exercises. The naval exercise in the Gulf of Oman between all three countries was already scheduled for February 2026. This is not a vague alignment of interests. This is a documented operational coordination structure between the second, third, and 18th largest economies in the world, built around a shared objective of demonstrating that Western economic pressure no longer produces the compliance it once produced. And here is the question we want to ask you right now, because this community genuinely divides on this point. Do you think China's support for Iran is a strategic calculation designed to test the limits of American power ahead of a future Taiwan scenario? Or do you think it is primarily about energy security and has nothing to do with the Taiwan question? Write your answer in the comments, because the analysts in Washington cannot agree on this, and your perspective actually matters here. Now, let us talk about the mechanism that makes this moment structurally different from every previous confrontation between Washington and its adversaries. The dollar weapon is the most powerful geopolitical instrument ever created by any government in human history. The ability to exclude a country from dollar-denominated transactions is more devastating than any military blockade because it does not require ships or soldiers. It operates through bank compliance departments and correspondent banking relationships. But the dollar weapon has a critical vulnerability. It only works if there is no alternative payment architecture. From 2015 to 2026, China built the alternative. The yuan is now used in 29% of international trade transactions. That number was 4% in 2015. China's SWIFT alternative, the CIPS system, processes transactions for banks in dozens of countries. The New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the SCO payment mechanisms collectively represent a parallel financial infrastructure that did not exist a decade ago. If you hold a mortgage denominated in a currency tied to interest rates set by a Federal Reserve that is watching the dollar's share of global trade fall, this is not abstract to you. Higher rates mean higher monthly payments, and the pressure on American rates is partly structural, coming from a slow shift in global reserve currency preferences that no single administration has been able to reverse. If you have retirement savings in equity markets that price in dollar stability, and you are watching a geopolitical realignment that structurally challenges the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, the mathematics of your retirement calculation has a variable in it that your financial advisor is probably not discussing with you. Now, let us look at 3 realistic scenarios for what comes next. The first scenario is the realistic baseline. The United States applies targeted secondary sanctions against mid-tier Chinese banks and individual entities involved in the Iran military technology pipeline. The Chinese entities restructure overnight. The Iranian oil flow continues at 1.5 million barrels per day. The political optics give Washington a press cycle. The structural situation does not change. The second scenario is the escalation path. Washington decides the only way to actually enforce its Iran policy is to go after major Chinese financial institutions with full secondary sanctions. The economic consequences, domestically and for European allies who run 800 billion euros per year in trade with China, make this politically unsurvivable for any administration. European partners explicitly refuse to follow the transatlantic alliance fractures publicly over economic self-interest. The dollar takes a confidence shock. The Fed has to respond. The consumer pays. The third scenario is the one almost nobody is modeling, and it is the most interesting. Saudi Arabia has been in simultaneous contact with both Washington and Beijing since the strikes began. China mediated the Saudi-Iran normalization. In 2023, Riyadh now has deep economic ties with both Washington and Beijing. The unexpected scenario is that China uses its position as the only power with credibility in both Tehran and Riyadh to broker a ceasefire framework that Washington cannot offer, because Washington is a party to the conflict. If that happens, China exits this crisis not as Iran's patron, but as the indispensable mediator of Middle East security, replacing a role the United States held since 1973. That scenario does not require China to fire a single missile. It requires only that China has more economic relationships in the region than any other external power, and by almost every measure it does. By the end of 2025, China had become the primary trading partner for more countries in the world than the United States, for the first time since 1945. That number represents something that no amount of military spending reverses quickly. Where are you watching this video from right now? Write your country in the comments, because this story is landing very differently depending on whether you are in Europe, the Gulf, Southeast Asia, or North America. And we want to understand how this community is spread across the world. Now let us look at what the next 90 days actually look like in concrete terms. The US Treasury's February 24th sanctions package targeted Iran's shadow fleet and missile networks. Those measures will produce prosecutable cases against specific companies and individuals. They will not change the volume of Iranian oil flowing to China. The Chatham House analysis, published in February 2026, notes that China bought more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil in 2025 at significant discount accounting for 13.5% of all the oil China consumed. That is not a marginal transaction that Beijing will abandon under symbolic pressure. Iran, according to Reuters, is close to finalizing a deal for supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles from China. If that deal closes, it materially changes the threat calculation in the Strait of Hormuz, where 21% of global oil supply transits. A weapon of that type, operated from Iranian territory against the US naval presence that has been the guarantor of Gulf shipping since the 1980s, is not a symbolic upgrade. And this is the moment where the Chatham House characterization of China playing the long game becomes relevant in a way that is uncomfortable to state. Plainly, China is using Iran as a laboratory. Washington's maximum pressure campaign against Tehran forced China and Iran to build an entire alternative economic architecture: shadow tanker fleets, yuan, payment loops, gold bullion, settlement channels, and barter exchange mechanisms. Those systems now exist. They are tested, they work. And Beijing knows exactly how. They perform under maximum Western pressure, because they have been running under maximum Western pressure for years. If you are in Beijing and you are watching this experiment succeed, and you are thinking about the possibility of a future Taiwan scenario, you are not watching Iran and thinking this is a sacrifice. You are thinking this is the most valuable geopolitical research program ever conducted. The parallel financial system tested in Iran is the dress rehearsal, and Washington cannot unsanction its way back into the leverage it had before those systems were built. So here is where we are this week. On March 3rd, 2026, China has officially and publicly declared its support for Iran's sovereignty and security in direct response to US and Israeli military strikes. Russia is in alignment. A three-way strategic pact is in place. The UN Security Council veto structure gives Tehran diplomatic protection from multilateral escalation. The yuan payment loop gives Tehran economic survival. The shadow fleet gives Tehran oil revenue. Washington's three traditional pillars of pressure on Iran: economic isolation, diplomatic isolation, and technological isolation, are each being neutralized by a different Chinese mechanism operating simultaneously. The Western analysts telling you this is just posturing are technically correct that China has not committed to military intervention. They are analytically wrong about what the absence of military commitment means. In this case, Beijing does not need to fire anything. The economic and diplomatic architecture it has built produces strategic outcomes without kinetic action. This is what 30 years of infrastructure investment looks like when it is deployed. It does not look like a battle. It looks like a Tuesday morning announcement that changes the structure of the game. And here is the question that genuinely divides serious analysts and that we want to leave you with today. Does Washington still have a credible path to changing Iran's strategic behavior through economic pressure, given that the alternative financial architecture China has built is now mature and documented, or has the maximum pressure model permanently lost its effectiveness against any country that has a deep economic relationship with Beijing? There is no consensus answer to that question. The economists and the strategists disagree. The people who built the sanctions architecture disagree with the people who study how economies adapt to it. Write your answer in the comments, because in 5 years, when we look back at this week in March 2026, the people who got that question right will have understood something that almost everyone else missed. And that understanding is not about geopolitics in the abstract. It is about the rules of the world that will govern your savings, your supply chains, and the price of everything you buy for the next decade. Do not look away from this one.